Hello, my name is Danielle Nelson, and I'm presenting my rhetorical criticism of the film It Chapter 1. To start, I'd like to give some background information about the film I have chosen for this rhetorical criticism. It Chapter 1 is a film released in 2017 that was directed by Andres Muschietti. For a brief plot synopsis, this film follows a group of sixth graders from the town of Derry, Maine. Our protagonists notice that other children from the town of Derry are going missing and, through a series of events, become entangled with a demonic ancient clown entity. This clown, named Pennywise, has a plan to continue to steal the children of Derry and feed off of their fear. In order to prevent Pennywise from continuing to terrorize the town, all of the children must face their own individual worst fears. It Chapter 1 is considered and was marketed as a horror film. However, this categorization brought up debate in many audience members who claimed that the film wasn't scary enough and was more like watching a coming-of-age story than an actual horror film. These comments piqued my interest, and I decided to create my criticism based off of these comments. We will be using the framework of a generic analysis in order to solve a specific research question about the film It Chapter 1. The first step to conducting this criticism was finding a framework. The framework that I have chosen is for a generic criticism from Sonja K. Foss's Rhetorical Criticism, Exploration and Practice. You can see the first steps of a generic criticism listed out in front of you. First, you select an artifact. We've chosen It Chapter 1. Then you analyze your artifact, and then you develop a research question about your artifact. The missing fourth step is to actually conduct the criticism, which of course you will see later in my presentation. So, after I completed the first steps of selecting my artifact and analyzing my artifact, I had to come up with a research question about It Chapter 1. An example of a research question from Foss's book is this artifact successful in fulfilling the required characteristics of its genre? I took that general shape of a question and I applied it to my film. So our research question here is, does the film It Chapter 1 successfully fulfill all the required characteristics of the horror genre? In order to conduct this rhetorical analysis, I had to choose a methodological framework that would hopefully lead us to the answer to our research question. The methodological framework that I have chosen for It Chapter 1 is very loosely based off of the steps in an example of genre analysis that is shown in the paper Analysis of Precedent Designs, Competitive Analysis Meets Genre Analysis by Arvola in 2010. Here you can see that I have boiled down these steps and I have changed the language to better suit a generic criticism of a film. The very first of these steps is to map out and group the content of your text. I have also chosen to map out the content and commonly associated elements of my genre as well. Since we are talking about film, the elements we are mostly looking at are either narrative or parts of mise-en-scène in the films. This step is primarily note-taking and is not included in this presentation. However, step number 2, identifying purpose and the elements of the content, will be included in this presentation because it is imperative in completing step 3. Step 3 is identifying what is shared and what is not shared in terms of characteristics and elements in my text and also the genre. Comparing this film and the horror genre and noting the similarities and the differences will guide us to the answer to our research question. To start, I have to identify the elements of the horror genre. The first and most common element you can expect to see in a horror film is themes of uncertainty and a fear of the unknown. Excessive violence and gory imagery are also integral parts of the horror genre and are expected by audiences, as well as weapons. For example, the knife covered in blood is usually associated with horror. One of the most unique elements associated with the horror genre of film is the idea of monsters, creatures, things that go bump in the night, the undead, and in general an idea of something being less than human. Psychological disturbances are also a well-repeated theme throughout the genre of horror. For example, The Shining. Slashers, which is a slang term for a film with excessive gore, are unique to the horror genre as well. And in addition, special effects that help create the slasher effect, or monsters in general. And finally, in many horror films, they're not necessarily narrative driven the entire time. There is a story as a backbone, but mostly the focus is on the fear and the visceral excitement that is created in the viewers of the film. When considering the purpose of horror films, just like any other genre, it's very important to keep in mind that the sociological, psychological, and political context of whatever is happening in the world at the time that genre trends will affect the meanings and the trends that are shown in the film. With that being said, many sociological fears are often expressed in horror films. Examples of these fears involve issues with patriarchy, differences between genders, and homosexuality. One of the purposes of these films that express these sociological fears is actually to create some kind of catharsis for the audience by resolving them. When concerning issues of patriarchy, sexual women are often punished by the killer of these slasher films. Another example is that the bad guy or the monster in most of these films can often be quite flamboyant, and most theorists will consider that a representation of the homosexual. So when they cannot complete their mission, it resolves this fear. On a much broader spectrum, horror is a unique genre because it incites a visceral pleasure in the viewer. Horror films incite a physical reaction in the viewer and appeals to different emotions than other genres of film do. People like horror films because they allow the viewer to face the very human experiences of death and bodily violence from a safe physical distance. Viewers can feel secure while undergoing these unique experiences. It is also worth noting that film techniques in most horror films will typically discourage the viewer from identifying with the protagonist of the films, primarily because that protagonist usually will perish. This changes the relationship between the viewer and the film so that the viewer feels more like they are watching what happens to another person rather than living out the experience of the character instead. The elements of It Chapter 1 that you see listed in front of you go from most similar to the horror genre of film to least similar to horror films. Right off the bat, we have a horror film iconography, and that is in a monster or a less than human character. Pennywise is a demonic entity in the film. Also, there is a general theme of uncertainty around this monster character, which qualifies for the general theme of uncertainty in horror films. We also have gore iconography, which is also included in most horror films. We see blood and excessive amounts of blood in It Chapter 1. We also see several other types of less than human characters and also representations of psychological disturbance in the phobias of the individual protagonist children. Just like in many other horror films, intensive special effects are used to show these phobias, show the other monstrous elements of It Chapter 1, and in general to drive the narrative of the main villain Pennywise. The narrative of It Chapter 1 is one of the most important elements to the film. All of the scenes in the film and all of the mise-en-scène relate back to the narrative line, and that is what drives this film. Because narrative is so critical to the success of this film, many scenes show the protagonists of the film simply bonding, doing regular daily activities, without any mention of the previous monstrous elements that qualify this as a horror movie. It is also worth noting that filmography and character developing techniques are used to actually encourage the viewers to identify with the protagonists. When considering the purpose of It Chapter 1, I wanted to see where it placed among other films that are adapted from Stephen King novels. The incredibly famous films like Carrie, Shining, Pet Sematary, and Cujo are all films that are adapted from Stephen King's horror novels, and as such, they're considered horror films. However, I didn't feel that It Chapter 1 fit nearly as closely in terms of narrative to any of these films than it does to the film Stand By Me. Stand By Me is a film that surrounds a group of children that find a dead body in the woods, but it is most often considered a coming-of-age story. In the reference cited here, the author explains how Stand By Me has elements of both coming of age and passage of adolescence, but also of terror and horror. When comparing that idea to the elements of It Chapter 1 as shown on the previous slide, I found that It Chapter 1 is much more similar to Stand By Me than the previously mentioned Stephen King adapted films. Since It Chapter 1 has the fairly clear moral of facing your fears to save your loved ones and themes of character identification for the viewer, it's very clear that at least one purpose of this film is to share that moral. Since It Chapter 1 is so similar to a film that is considered coming of age, we can say for sure that it at least mostly has a purpose of causing the audience to relive nostalgia of passing adolescence, just like coming of age films do. So, to summarize what horror films and It Chapter 1 have in common, first, we face uncertainty as a theme. There is also the excessive use of special effects to create a reaction in the audience. We have characters who are monsters and less than humans, and they are the source of at least part of the fear that we see in these films. Death is incredibly important and integral to the plot lines, both in horror films and in It Chapter 1. We see plenty of gore in It Chapter 1 and in horror films, and also it is worth mentioning that Nightmare on Elm Street, which is typically regarded as a classic horror film, does have a minimized adult presence, just like It Chapter 1. While Nightmare on Elm Street does involve teenagers instead of sixth graders, it is worth noting that both of these films do not involve much adult interaction with the source of fear. However, we can see here that It Chapter 1 and in general horror films do not share that many characteristics when you compare it to the differences. First of all, in classic horror, the protagonists of the films are usually teens and young adults, primarily because that's the audience that these films are targeted towards. However, It Chapter 1 is obviously focused on quite young children. Additionally, the underlying sociological fear of consensual sexuality, and the punishment of consensual sexuality, so the group of teens who sneak off into the woods to make out with their boyfriends getting murdered first. That is not shown at all in It Chapter 1. There is little reference to sexuality, and the only hint at sexuality we get is by an older man who is predatory, and so his punishment makes more sense. The homosexuality and the gender relations of the antagonists in most classic horror films underline the sociological fears that drive these narratives. However, we don't see much mention of anything representative of homosexuality in It Chapter 1. Pennywise is expressive and a bit flamboyant, but otherwise there's no real disparity between gender relations in the film. Classic horror films often have the icon of the knife or other torturous weapons. Consider Saw, for example. However, in It Chapter 1, there is minimal weaponry. The only thing resembling a weapon is one of the guns that is used to put down sheep on a sheep farm, and that is used by the protagonists. In classic horror films, the narrative focus is all about the chase between the protagonists being chased by the killer, and typically without strong narrative lines, you could still probably figure out what was going on in the film. However, in It Chapter 1, there is a huge narrative focus, and it is primarily on the development of these children who are, of course, in the right age for a coming-of-age film. Once again, in classic horror, you typically, as a viewer, are not encouraged to identify with the protagonists. Rather, you are a third party. However, in It Chapter 1, you are encouraged to identify with the protagonists, and they do all survive. Horror films also often have an underlying every man for himself tone, whereas It Chapter 1 is focused completely on teamwork and friendship and hope, perseverance, which is completely different. And finally, in classic horror films, the ending is typically ambiguous, with only one character getting away and walking away into a bright light. However, in Chapter 1, there is a clear, definite ending to the story, and while the story may continue on, you feel satisfied. Humans like to compile media into designated genres because they give us, as audiences, expectations and ideas for films or texts in general that fall into that specific genre. These aspects are shared elements, shared narrative structures, shared camera elements even. However, films must have differences in a genre, otherwise we'd be watching the same film over and over again. That means that some of these films and texts in general can have a fair amount of differences and still qualify for a genre. To answer our research question, does It Chapter 1 successfully fulfill the genre requirements for horror? The evidence that you've seen in this presentation points to the answer mostly or halfway. It Chapter 1 does meet a lot of the qualifications in terms of iconography, some general themes, even some narrative and plot structure that we can expect from the horror genre of film. However, many of the other themes of It Chapter 1 and the general purpose of It Chapter 1 don't completely align with what we expect from a horror film. Because It Chapter 1 is so different from what we would expect from a horror film, but still contains the typical icons and some narrative structures that we would expect from horror, I'm going to say that It Chapter 1 is likely a marker for the evolution of the horror genre. We can look at other modern horror films like Us and Get Out by Jordan Peele that show that changes in themes and changes of purposes in horror films is a new trend when we look at the horror genre. And I would say that It Chapter 1 fits into this category, a modern horror. And that is my conclusion. It Chapter 1 having so many similarities in terms of iconography with classic horror, but completely different purpose and themes, gives us a glance at what horror films could look like for the future. As you can see before you, these are the sources that I used to complete this project. Thank you so much for listening to my rhetorical criticism of It Chapter 1.